Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody to session number 9 for the book of Daniel. Tonight we will be covering chapter 7, but only a small portion of chapter 7. It repeats itself towards the end and actually gets into more and more description of the vision and dream that Daniel's having. But as we start chapter 7, what we finished up last week was the last chapter on history. Remember, 1 through 6 was mostly historical in nature, and the lion's den, which is, everybody's heard of the lion's den, and Meshach and Shadrach and Abednego. They've heard of all this. That's what we've covered all these stories about Daniel in its history. I say stories, but it's all been substantiated through history with extra biblical writings. So we finished up the history portion and we started into chapter 7. 7 through 12 is pure prophecy. It's probably the most full section of prophecy there is in the entire Bible, both Old and New. It's very much a history of God's plan for mankind from the beginning to the end times. And so we're going to get into the first section of this tonight. And when you get into this, you get into a lot of controversy. You do. We've got a lot of different opinions on meanings of things. We also have several that agree, and we'll give you what those agreements are. Again, as Annette said earlier, we're not here to say this is the truth. We're here to say this is what it says. These are options. We need to learn from other people who have done the study, take from that, but always come to your own, draw to your own conclusion. Always draw to your own conclusion. Don't take what I say or Annette says or what any of the commentators we say as being the thing. You yourself have to be in agreement. So as we enter into chapter 7 is a chapter around dreams and visions and prophecy. I mean, that's what it's around. Chapter 6 was miracles, right? Now we're starting 7 prophecies. And those of you who've been with us a long time know that some of the first studies we did was called the Case for Easter. And it was based on a book showing statistically why Easter is actually verifiable through the history, through artifacts. I'm not going to go into that detail, but the reason why I was bringing it up, because a lot of what we spent time on during that Bible study, the Case of Easter, was around prophecy and what prophecy means. We went through just Passion Week alone. Christ satisfied probably up to 100 prophecies just in the Passion Week alone. And each one of those prophecies had a probability. And they weren't simple probabilities. The probabilities of some of those individual prophecies were astronomical as they were on their own, much less to be filled. So with that, one of the authors and commentators that we follow is John Mcauthor. Don't subscribe to everything he says, but he has a lot of good information. He's probably 80, 83, 84 years old. He's been in ministry since his early 20s. Very, very knowledgeable. Video, if you follow him, has commentary on every Bible in every book in the Bible, plus multiple commentaries on the same book. He updates them. So we have a lot of respect for him, but again, we have to use our own discernment on some of the things we don't quite agree. But he said, and I'm going from him, I have some notes here, is that we know we can get a comfort for the Bible because archaeologically, historical, extra biblical writings verify the facts that what the Bible is saying more and more and more each day. We have more today than we had a year ago. And you go back 200 years, we got thousands of artifacts discovered in the last couple of years with the advancement of archaeology and being able to bring up these ruins to a point to where we have information we didn't have before. So the Bible can very much be substantiated on just the historical artifacts alone. The other thing that we know is that uniqueness of the Bible, its ability to tie all the books together, and the person of Jesus Christ, the way the man spoke, and it's recorded for us, is like no other man spoke. The things that he came out with would just flabbergast you. People would just, their eyes would open. So just the person of Christ, when you read his word and you see, you know that it has to be writing from God. But more than anything else, what substantiates the Bible is prophecy and the fulfillment of that prophecy. So if you look at the most important substantiation for the Bible, it is prophecy and the fulfillment of that prophecy. So with that, I'm going to read a quote from Mullane, which is an old commentator. And this is what he said, and it's a quote: "Prophecy is a declaration of future events, such as no human wisdom or forecast is sufficient to make. It depends on a knowledge of innumerable contingencies of the human affairs, which belongs exclusively to the omniscience of God, so that from its very nature, prophecy must be divine revelation. There's no way prophecy comes from men." Mcauthor gave examples of a lot of people that claimed they were soothsayers, they were palm readers, and they could predict the future. One of them was a Dixon, Jean Dixon. Jean Dixon.
My dad was big into her, so I knew very well about that.
So he's pretty emphatic that a human being can't prophesize and predict it. Will they get lucky every once in a while? Yes, but it doesn't mean they have any ability to really quote prophet or make prophet come true, prophecy. So he gave an example, and I used this example back in Case for Easter. In Case of Easter, I was using a man and a woman. One was right-handed, one was left-handed. And then I used the case of silver dollars. And I said, if you had the state of Texas filled with silver dollars, 1 foot deep, and you put one black silver dollar in the state, you blindfolded the guy and you asked him to go pull that silver dollar out, statistical odds of that happening are no way it can happen. It just won't, statistically. That is nothing compared to the probability of what Jesus did. Mcauthor gave another interesting study on prophecy and probability, and I thought it was interesting. So again, we're going through a lot of this front end tonight because we think it's important to get the importance of this in prophecy. And so when we look at a coin, a dime, a quarter, a penny, a nickel, it doesn't matter. We look at a coin and we flip it one time, it's either going to be heads or tails. So the probability is 50%. That's 1 divided by 2. That's pretty simple, right? Now, if we take 2 coins and we flip one and we flip the other, the probability of them both being heads actually turns out to be 1/4, or 25%. Because the combination you have with 2 coins, heads or tails, it could be both heads, both tails, heads first, tails second, tails first, heads second. That's all that can come from that outcome. Now take that forward and we go to 3 coins, and then we go to 100 coins. Once you get that high in the, let's say 40 coins, 50 coins, or 100 coins, they were going, if you put 100 coins, each probability of the 100 coin is 1 in 2. When I told you the 100 prophecies for Jesus Christ, each prophecy was probably like 1/10 to the 50th power. We're talking about prophecies for each. The probability of each of these prophecies were astronomical in their own. You multiply probability together to get what the new probability is if you had two things that were happening. So the way they put this is that if you had 100 people flipping coins to get 100 flips, it would take 2 billion planets with 4 billion people on each planet, all flipping coins, and you would never get to the probability statistics of trying to get 100 hits. So the point I'm trying to speak here is what Daniel is speaking about, and the prophecy, the probability of its occurring has to come from God. And if that doesn't prove the Bible is true, then I don't know what else you could use. So we take that note as we get into the study of Daniel, that what Daniel says, we need to take serious. What he has prophesied, we need to take serious. We need to take it to heart. So sorry for that big introduction, but I thought it was important to just bring people up to that level. Now we'll start into Daniel 7, verses 1 through 3.
In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head while on his bed, and he wrote down the dream, telling the main facts. Daniel spoke, saying, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea, and the four great beasts came up from the sea, each different from the other. So what do you think the great sea is? Any ideas? When we look at the Bible times, we know we have the Sea of Galilee. Sea of Galilee is really more of a lake. It's the shores are very visible on the other side. It's big, but it's not like Lake Pontchartrain or anything.
Closer to Lake Norfolk.
Yeah. Probably smaller than that even. And then they had the Dead Sea, which is bigger than the Sea of Galilee, but is also not this. So most people feel that this is the Mediterranean Sea, and that all of these beasts that depict different kingdoms, if they are explained correctly, all have roots through the Mediterranean coastal area. Another thought is in a few times in Psalm and Isaiah, the word sea is used to refer to Gentiles. And so I think that's an important distinction to go ahead and make for while we're reading this, because we are in the age of the Gentiles.
Right. And so the first thing to note here before I get to the next question, it says in the first year of Belshazzar. So, whoa, wait a second. But Belshazzar died in chapter 5. Then we did chapter 6. Now we're chapter 7. And now we're back to the first year of Belshazzar. What's going on? We said from the beginning, the first 6 books are somewhat chronological. When you get into dreams, now it's going back in time. So this is going back in time while Babylon is still the empire that's in charge. Because remember, the Medo-Persians took it over. Cyrus was the emperor, and they destroyed Babylon, took it over, and now it was the Medo-Persian Empire. So now we're back into the Babylon Empire with Belshazzar. So don't miss that, and don't get confused by it either. So what do you think we know what was written down about the dream? What do you think Daniel is sharing with us? Well, one of the things we discover is while Daniel is giving us a lot of information about dreams and visions and prophecy, he's not giving us all. If you look at the end of verse 1, it says, then he wrote down the dream, telling the main facts. So all he did was go over the main facts of the dream. There's much more to this, and I think when we get to chapter 9, he's actually instructed to seal up this prophecy for a time. So Daniel's not giving us all that was seen, and that's not unusual. Remember back in our study of the book of Revelation, John was given the next set of stuff and said not to write about it. We all wondered about it. What was it? So God wants us to know certain things, God doesn't. So what Daniel has given us is really the main facts. He's not given us the detail. That leads to a lot of people guessing about what it is and what it isn't. That's why we get into people having different opinions about this. So it makes it interesting, but we know that it's God's intention that it wasn't shared any deeper. So with that, we'll go to the next verse. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. I watched till its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the earth and made to stand on 2 feet like a man. And a man's heart was given to it. So what do you think, what does this, what do you think this beast represents? It's a winged lion. Now, it looks like it was light, so it wasn't, but it looks like. We're pretty much on an agreement across the board that this is probably historic, and it's Babylon, and I'll tell you why. And we're going to get into more detail there, so I'm not going to get into that much detail. There's also some people thinks it's present day. We'll talk about that as well. And so it's most likely Babylon. Babylon's gates had winged lions, and we went into that last time. This is one of the actual archaeological finds that was on in Babylon, that's actually in London in the museum that you can go look at. So with this image, Babylon with lions and eagles, and both of those, one is the king of the air and one is the king of the land. And so they use this quite a bit in basically their culture. And obviously Nebuchadnezzar was big on it because it's even on their gates coming into their temples.
So one thing that they brought up that the lion is the king of the jungle, or king of the animals, and the eagle is the king of the birds. And Nebuchadnezzar was considered to be the king of kings of human rulers. And so that is another thing that they point toward Babylon. But I think the images on the gates are pretty convincing. What do you think of the meaning of the plucked off feathers? He watched till its wings were plucked off, and then it was lifted up from the earth to stand on 2 feet like a man. What do you think that references?
Would that be like stripping away of power?
It would be, exactly. Did that happen historically that you know of?
Remember chapter 4?
Well,
So Nebuchadnezzar, if you remember, was...
Go ahead, Robert.
Well, Nebuchadnezzar became weak and went insane and everything. I was just thinking about that.
That's what everyone thinks that this is. So if you think he's lifted up from the earth, if you remember when he went insane, he was crawling around on all fours and eating grass. All of his kingdom, everything, his power was stripped from him. So they were saying that's his wings being plucked off. He was able to stand up on 2 feet, and he was given a new heart. And we know that Nebuchadnezzar, after this time of insanity, when he was restored, that he gave God the glory as the one true God. And we feel like he had a new mind and a new heart, and probably was a changed man. And convincingly, many people feel like he might have given his life over to God. And it's very possible we would see him in heaven. So across the board, very convincingly, people point to this being Babylon, and I don't think that there's too much disagreement.
We have just a couple of commentators that don't agree, and we'll hit upon that.
Maybe more next week.
Next week we'll hit upon it.
And the funny thing about this study is we're going through each of these beasts, but then the interpretation of the dream is next week. It was too much to try and put in one. And so this might be shorter today, and then we'll build on it next week is how this will go.
So verse 5, and suddenly another beast, a second beast, like a bear, it raised up on one side and had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And they said thus to it, arise, devour much flesh. So what do you think this beast represents? The last one was Babylon. And if we're talking about history, what do you think this beast represents and why? Okay, we were pretty unanimous across the board from a historical perspective, not from a non-historical, is that this beast actually represents the Medo-Persian Empire. That's the beast that raises up. You say, well, what does it mean? It was raised up on one side. Well, the Medes were insignificant. The Persians were the big side of the Medo-Persian Empire. They came together through marriage to build the empire, but the Persians were always the strongest. And predominantly, the Persian culture is still around in areas. So it was raised up on that side because it was strong on that side. But it had 3 ribs in its mouth. Yeah, what does that mean? We'll talk about that next week, but we think it's going to be Egypt, they conquered. Babylon, they conquered. And Lydia, they conquered, which is modern day Turkey. So these were the 3 ribs, as most commentators agreed that that's what this represented. The Medo-Persian Empire, the 3 ribs were the major conquest that they had. And like I said, raised up on one side really meant that the Persians were stronger than the Medes. So this pretty much, we think, is going to be Medo-Persian Empire. Okay.
So if we go to verse 6, it says, after this, I looked, and there was another, like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings, on its back, 4 wings of a bird. The beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. And so the question is, like the others, what do you think this beast represents? And historically, if we look, Robert, did you have something?
With the Roman?
Not yet.
Not yet. I'm jumping empires.
Do you remember what came between the Roman Empire and the Medo-Persians? Alexander the Great. It was the Greek Empire. Now, notice these things don't say, Daniel's not saying, I looked and there was a beast and it was a leopard. All of these are like a leopard. And so he's drawing this analogy of what he's seeing and what it's like. But obviously, there's no leopards with wings. But the fact that this is a leopard, they think that it is Alexander. It was the Greek Empire, which came and conquered lands after the Medo-Persians and really expanded the holding. The Greek Empire, the holding was all of that Central Asia, all the way to India. And Alexander the Great conquered very, very quickly. He swiftly came through as a very young man, and by the age of 30, was lamenting the fact that he had no more lands to conquer. That he had conquered the whole known world as far as he knew. They think that the wings on the back represent speed because he did it with such great speed. But the question would be, okay, well, why are there 4 heads? Alexander the Great passed away at the age of 33, so he passed away quite young. And the kingdom was divided among his 4 main generals. So we have Lysimachus, and he took over the kingdoms of Macedonia. We have Cassander, who took over this area in here. We have Seleucus, who's the king of the north, and then we have Ptolemy, which is the king of the south. And so these people, so you have Lysimachus is Greece and Macedonia, Cassander is Asia Minor, and then the king of the north is Persia and up through India, and then this is Egypt and Arabia in that area. And so it does seem very plausible that this could be the Greek Empire because it was divided among 4 generals. People can find a lot of fault with this. And again, like I said, next week when we get into the interpretation, we'll probably go into much more detail about why people believe or disbelieve that this is a correct interpretation. But if you listen, again, if we do probability, if we listen to 50 people talking about Daniel chapter 7, I would say 90% of them are going to lay it out as the Greek Empire.
Yeah. And like Annette said, we're going to hit a couple of things. There's other groups that think these are families, not the generals, because their point was that we're more than 4 generals, not just 4 generals. Antipater, the famous Greek ruler that was terrible, he's not even mentioned anywhere in here. So that's another reason they said, yeah. So there again, you get across these where you get differences. And what we do is we're trying to pull the commonality. And this seems to be the most common thing. Does it really matter that much? No. The fact is, if we know it's the Greek Empire, we're pretty sure that when Daniel saw this, the Greek, he didn't even know Greek Empire existed at that point. So again, he's like a leopard. He'd had 4 heads, but he's seen something he can't describe humanly. That's why it says like. So he's trying to use this, and we get into the same stuff when we get into Revelation as well. This is so much overlapping to that.
Hasn't Daniel been dead for like 100 years?
Oh, after this?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Quite
Yeah,
a
Daniel was way young.
Right.
All right, so let's go into the next couple of verses. This is the last beast. And after this, I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong. It had huge iron teeth. It was devouring, breaking into pieces, trampling on residue with his feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before, and it had 10 horns. I was considering the horns, and there was another horn, a little horn, coming up among them, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked out by their roots. And there, in this horn, were eyes like the eyes of man, and mouth speaking pompous words. Wow. So what do we think this beast really represents?
Robert?
This beach represents the Sicilian Empire. Romans.
Yeah. Many people thought it was Romans, but the fact is it's an empire to come. We're going to get into just a bit of the statue. And if you remember the statue, it had 2 iron legs. Had 2 iron legs at the bottom, which most people considered Rome. We have one commentator that's emphatically saying this is Muslim nations, and the 10 toes are 10 Muslim nations. This is not Rome revived at all. It's Muslim that's coming up. That's with us today. I'm not taking that on, but it's an interesting twist. Another one that said it wasn't Rome proper was one that we've been following here for the last several weeks. Basically say if you take what's called the years to day rule, each day is a year, and they went back and looked at times and a half time and multiplied that out. You remember we had that before. it comes out to 1,260 days. You take 1,260 days from this date, it goes to 1798, which was the French Revolution that destroyed the church-state process of Rome and the Vatican. The French Revolution put an end to that. And it put an end to most monarchies as well. And so this guy happened to claim that this is that church-state process that is in existence all the way to 1798, and then it got divided, where Vatican is on its own. It's not married to a state. It's its own country, its own nation. And the rest of Rome didn't get conquered. It just got moved into different pieces, right? So Germany was part of Rome. It came and made Germany. So I'm not sure that I take anything other than I think the iron is Rome. But when you look at the 10 horns, remember the clay statue had 10 toes, feet of clay and iron. And we know the 10 toes is yet to come. We think the legs of iron are history. Rome, like I said, didn't get conquered. It just divided and became, and then kind of went off its own, just went off into history. Some claim it's coming back as the European Union. I don't know. They say that's where the 10 toes are. It's something to come in the future. Again, we're going to get into this in more detail next week. But when you line these two things up, the first thing you look at was they look pretty similar. So with that, I'm going to let Annette answer the next question, and then we're going to read the final set of verses, which are not the next verses. And I explain when we get there.
So my question are verses 7 and 8 all happening at the same time, or is there a gap?
And at first I didn't even doubt, because it seems when you look at this statue that the lion in Babylon, and then the bear in Medo-Persia, and the leopard in Greece, and then Rome, it all seems to fit very well. I never really questioned it. But we do have some really big thinkers that have spent a lot of time looking at that. And there's things about this that make us think that there's probably a big gap when we look at this beast. So I think that the first thing came out with the iron teeth, and it's devouring and breaking to pieces and trampling everything. That does fit the description of Rome that we know historically, but that also that we had when we discussed the statue, that Rome came in and it was known just to take everything and level it. It left nothing. It destroyed everything and everything. And that was really the iron. But then it talks about the 10 horns. And so I find it plausible. And like I said, next week, we're going to get into even more detail and by names and specifics and have it all laid out for you. But I do think it's possible that this could be Rome. But then we go to the 10 horns, which for me would be similar to going from the legs and being Rome to down here. There should maybe be a line down here with the feet of clay and iron, which is a kingdom to come. And then below that, which is on here, if you remember, the rock came and crushed this, and then went on to become its own kingdom. So there's a sixth kingdom, which is the kingdom of Christ and the new creation, the new heaven. But we do think that it was probably that the 10 horns represent something to come. And the little horn, there is some debate on that. Most people will say that the little horn, as it comes up and displaces 3 kings, that the little horn is the Antichrist. But there are other opinions and things out there that could be the little horn. And as Dave said, there was when the Roman Empire and the church were united as one state religion. And I think it was in 1789, after the French Revolution, church and state were separated, and then the church became its own, as Dave said, and then the Roman Empire, Rome became what is now Italy, as well as all the rest of the European nations. So it's very interesting concept to think that there's a gap in this beast.
Yeah, and I think it's even our forefathers here in the United States had enough wisdom to know that you have to separate state and church. If you go back, and I know a lot of this is history, but it's so interesting. And when I say history, this is extra biblical historical writing that we're talking about. This is not taking the Bible and not verifying it. But Constantine was the first emperor of Rome and became Christian. And I'm not going to get into that story because there's still, the way he came about that is still somewhat embedded in the Catholic religion today. So I'm not going to go into that side of it. But he basically allowed Christianity to flourish. And then I can't remember the next one that actually forced Christianity to be the only religion. And if you did anything else, it was heresy. You were thrown in jail, you killed. You couldn't follow anything else than Christianity, or you would be killed. And, you know, we got into the medieval times and the holy wars and all that, and the killing of Christians that were not following the same Christian because they believed as the Roman group did, and they considered it heresy. And heresy means you're put to death. And so they didn't even hesitate in the Crusades of wiping out Christians who believed in the Bible. And so the history of this is pretty bad. Our forefathers had enough wisdom to say you have to separate state and religion. They both have to be on their own. You can't marry them together. That's nothing but problems. So with that, we're going to skip a couple of verses because it gets into actually the coronation of Jesus Christ. And then we pick up a little bit. These should, in my opinion, should have been put ahead, but they're not. So we're going to skip to verses 11 and 12, and then we're going to go back and pick up 9 and 10 next week when we start the study. So if you're following along with your Bible, you need to see that we have skipped it. So we're going to get 11 and 12. I watched because of the sound of the pompous words which the horn was speaking. I watched till the beast was slain, and his body destroyed and given to the burning flame. As for the rest of the beasts, they had their dominion taken away, yet their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. Now, what the heck does that mean? All right, chapter 2 is the statue, the gold head, the silver. Here it is. So we're looking at Daniel 7, and it lines up. But one is a statue, and one is beast or something, monsters. And so we're going to talk about the two views on this. That's Annette's question next. But do you think these two, chapter 7 and chapter 2, are lined up talking about the same thing, but just presented differently? Yeah, we talked about the lion being Babylon that falls. We talk about the bear being Medo-Persian that falls. We talk about the Greeks, the leopard that falls. Roman never fell, remember? Rome never was conquered. It just divided into two states, and the Western states turned into Great Britain and France and Spain and Germany and all that. It just came their own countries. They just went away from the empire. It's like Texas decided they don't want to be part of the United States. So now they're just Texas a nation. That's kind of what happened to Rome, is that it came apart and they came their self-ruled, all separate nations. So as we look at this, they look like it pretty much lines up to chapter 2. Chapter 2 was prophecy, even though it was history as well, but it was prophecy. And so these two line up pretty much. Let's go back to that thing. As Ned said, Rome seemed to have ended around 17 AD, and that the 10 toes of clay and iron haven't come into existence yet. So there probably should be a line somewhere there, and we're looking at 5 kingdoms in Daniel 2. Pretty clear. The toes of iron is another kingdom yet to be here. And the stone comes down and crushes it. If you remember, a stone cut without, not made by hands, that's Jesus Christ. Crushed the stone at his feet, crushed the statue at his feet. What happened? You remember? The whole statue collapsed. It turned to ashes. It was blown away in the winds. It was non-existent, right? It was gone. Well, I had a little bit of struggle with chapter 2 saying, well, Babylon got destroyed in 539 BC, yet when Christ comes, he's going to destroy it again. Does that make sense? All right, what does it say here in verse 12? As for the rest of the beast, they had their dominion taken away, yet their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. So let me try to get where I'm coming from. I think 2 and 7 are pretty much lined up, even though we've got a couple of commentators that think 7 is current day nations. We're going to talk about that next time. And we'll go tell you who they are as well, at least who they think they are, which quite honestly, I don't agree with, but it doesn't matter. We want to present that to you so you know it. When you get down into this last piece, Daniel 7 doesn't have the Roman Empire depicted and a new Roman Empire or a kingdom yet to come. It has this one beast that may have been Rome, or the Roman Empire, we're not sure. But you have 5 kingdoms there, you have 4 kingdoms in 7. So unless you take the last beast and you split it up somewhere between the beast and its horns, or the little horn. So when we look at these two things, I think they are different to some degree, but they're overlapping unless you take this other view. So the possibility here, what most people believe, is that all of these are just a different look at this. And what I'm going to do is when we look at verse 12, as for the rest of the beasts, they had their dominion taken away, yet the life were prolonged for a season and a time. What does that mean? Well, if you look at it, if we look at Rome in this statue and the beast, and we consider Rome the beast is both present as well as past, because it's not yet here. The little horn hasn't come up yet, and the 10 kings haven't come up yet. That much we know. But if you look at these, they're pretty consistent. But this clause that says the other ones were prolonged and the last one was not, it was slain and it was destroyed and given to the burning flames. It was thrown down in the fiery pit. It was thrown down in as we go back to Revelation, that's where Satan and his buddies are for the 1,000-year millennium. It's that's what it's talking about. Well, actually, Babylonians and their culture didn't go away; they got conquered. The Persians and Medes, they're still around. The Greek, you still have the nation of Greek. The Romans are still around. So the nations weren't crumbled and brought to pieces and no longer existed. Their cultures existed, their people continued, their traditions, that all. Matter of fact, Greek prevalence went way into the Roman Empire. Greek was the prevalent word for a long time. It was spoken in the Roman Empire. And Greek still follows us today with Greeks, some of the Greek gods and everything else. Roman took the Greek gods and gave them Roman names. So what we're saying here is, this speaks pretty highly that Babylon did fall, but it wasn't crushed. And it will be crushed along with the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, and everybody else when Christ comes the second time. That's what it's talking about. This beast that it's talking about in the flame, being thrown into flames, is Christ's second coming. The other beast fell, came out of power, but their kingdoms continued for a time until Christ comes the second time. They're all going away. That's probably the best explanation that we could get out of some of the commentators that we're looking at. The little horn, as Annette said, most agree that that is Satan in some form, or the Antichrist, would say being powered by Satan. Excuse me. I was trying to hold it, I'm sorry. But that's something we'll get into a little bit later. I think that's pretty much where we're going to wind up. It's just where does the Antichrist come out of? That's probably one of the areas that we're going to talk, because people think they come from a different area. Some people, whether he's Jewish, comes out of the Jewish, comes out of the Gentiles. No, it may come out of the Muslims. So we'll get into that next week. We'll end this with this last question, which I thought was an interesting take on this, and I'll let Annette ask it and answer it.
So what's the difference between the kingdoms that were discussed in Nebuchadnezzar's vision and in Daniel's vision? Now, this study's a little bit different than some of our other ones, so it's mostly history, and people remain kind of silent. So I really like to hear people put their thinking caps on and look at this, because we have quite a bit of time. Tell me, what do you think the difference is between Nebuchadnezzar's dream and Daniel's dream? You see any differences?
I'm going to throw out something at you.
Okay.
Is it color coded? The crown on Daniel and the lion is gold.
That's a good point. What do you
And the
think
Rome is
about?
both gray.
Okay, let me throw this out, because I think you're on the right track. Let's tease it out a little bit in more detail. What do you think about gold? If you had a gold object, do you like that, or you think it's nice or not nice? Gold.
I like it.
You like it. Okay. Silver, another pleasing metal, right? You have silver jewelry, we have silver pleasing. The statue of Daniel is really quite pleasing. It looks at these kingdoms as colossal. And really what people put that in is that's man's view of these kingdoms. It's worthy. And when you say color coded, I really think you meant more like metal coated, and that it's considered, worthy and desirable, and it's brilliant, and it's colossal, and it's amazing. That's how Nebuchadnezzar saw it. And really, that's how man looks at these kingdoms. We look at when we watch movies, the most powerful victors in the battle, and we're looking, that's how we look at it. Then when you look at Daniel's, what do you think about these beasts? They're gruesome, right? I mean, they're not pleasant. Who wants to have a vision of this? I don't. I'd rather have a vision of a nice, beautiful statue than these terrifying, terrible beasts. And so what people said, well, Daniel 2 is man's concept of these victorious empires, but Daniel 7 is God's vision of these empires, that they're evil, bloody, killing machines that go on. And although we know he permits them to have dominion, he permits them to ascend to places of power and hold that power for the time that they have it, that this is God's how God looks at these empires. And I thought that was a really interesting difference, because obviously Nebuchadnezzar wasn't afraid of his statue. He was quite proud of the statue, so much so that he went to recreate it in chapter 5 in all gold. But whereas Daniel's, it's just a nightmare. It's not a nice dream at all. And so we feel that we're getting two different viewpoints on these kingdoms, God's viewpoint and man's viewpoint. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, and the way to probably put that is it shows you how distasteful God feels about man's kingdoms. You know, he views it as beastly, as bloody, as can't stand to look at it. And man views it as beautiful. Look what I've done. And so I thought it was really, really interesting. And I really hold to that's probably true, because the vision that Daniel had was from God. So it's God's view. It's not man's view. The vision that Nebuchadnezzar had was man's view of this. And so it's presented in two different ways.
But I still think that vision was from God. I mean, because
Oh, the vision was from God,
so
yeah, but
I
it was
think-
man's view of
I
that,
think
right.
God gave Nebuchadnezzar the vision that Nebuchadnezzar would relate to and see, whereas he gave Daniel his heart because he knew Daniel would faithfully represent it.
Right.
Represent it.
So it was really interesting. We have quite a bit to cover next time, the rest of the chapter. It's going to be really good, but some of it will be a repeat, because now we're going to get in the explanation of these. What happens is Daniel can't figure out what's going on. So thank God, what does he do? He asks an angel to explain it to him. So we get the explanation from the angel next week, at least on the fourth beast. The first three, he seemed to have a handle on. It looks that way. So it'll be an interesting study next week. We look forward to it. Any last minute questions or comments?
Has any earthly kingdom ever come into being without bloodshed?
Not really.
That's a good point. I can't,
You know,
I don't think so.
Amazing.
So,
That's how
a,
God sees them.
yeah, a reframe of that would be, has any man's kingdom come into being without bloodshed?
yeah, right.
But that's
Because
true.
Christ came without initial bloodshed. It wasn't there was no others who shed blood. It was just him.
Mhm.
A totally different sacrifice.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right. Any other comments, questions? We'll close with a couple of minutes left. That's the first time I think we ever
Yeah,
done it.
this is our first time ever finished.
On time. All right, crowd. We'll close in prayer.
Our dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time we had to look at history. Again, very different kind of study, but I think it's very pertinent to us now. I know looking at the history and getting a grasp of what happened, was predicted but happened already, gives us kind of a glimpse in what is predicted that is still to come. And so it gives us an assurance. I mean, these things were so readily found, proven true in history hundreds of years after this dream, that we know the things that are yet to come, we're assured they're coming. And we just pray we would be ready, that we're watching, and that we will be proclaiming the day of the Lord in our day-to-day walk. We praise you, we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Good night.